Artists, as well as illustrators, enjoy making pictures for children. They are an appreciative audience and react quickly and truthfully, but they have little time for art's sake and want the words and pictures to tell a good story. In the 20,000 volumes of the Opie collection, it's possible to trace the development of the artist's work for children from the 18th century onwards. The Bodleian Library, which houses the collection, has an extremely rare first edition of a book by one of the greatest artists who ever worked for children, The Songs of Innocence, a book of pictures and poems published in 1789 by William Blake.
Piping down the valleys wild, piping songs of pleasant glee, on a cloud I saw a child, and he laughing said to me, "Pipe a song about a lamb." So I piped with merry cheer, "Piper, pipe that song again." So I piped, he wept to hear.
I think that William Blake, rather like William Morris later in the Kelmscott productions, they were both people who carried their own personal art to extremes which no one else could ever hope to copy, but their influence was far greater later than it probably was at the time, especially in the case of William Blake, who, as he called it, illuminated his own books. He wrote the text, he wrote the poems, and then he coloured them. The number he could do was limited, and the number that was seen by children was probably even more limited. So their actual impact at the time was very restricted. On the other hand, he was considering text and illustrations as an integral whole in the book, and that was a very important way of looking at the illustrated book, not a book with pictures, but a pictured book.
That's the Bible. That's the original. Nobody's combined language and art. Nobody could, because nobody's ever been like him. And of course, with all the books he illustrated, all the prophecies, I think the best are Innocence and Experience, the most perfect renderings of language and imagery combined into one complete, total work of art. It's perfection.
The Songs of Innocence was the first book to be written, illustrated, printed, and published by the same person. Blake tells us that he learned the printing techniques from his dead brother Robert in a dream. They are so extraordinary that only recently has it been possible to reproduce them. Blake intended his book for children, but are they a suitable audience for it?
Anything that good is for children. It just has to be good enough and complicated enough, then it's for children. If it's reduced and simplified, then it's for grown-ups who don't want to be bothered or upset. That's what's known as a bestseller list. But if it's complicated and rich and dense, then of course it's for children, because they'll take the whole thing. They always do.
Father, Father, where are you going? Oh, do not walk so fast. Speak, Father, speak to your little boy, or else I shall be lost. The night was dark, no father was there. The child was wet with dew. The mire was deep, and the child did weep, and away the vapour flew.
40 years after Blake published his Songs of Innocence, a very different artistic style became fashionable: caricature.
It was something that was particularly popular, rather like the pun, between about the 1840s and the 1860s. It's a thing that has gone somewhat out of favour, and there was always this sort of rather peculiar broad humour, almost too broad for us now, in the illustration, a certain facetiousness whereby the artist seems to be standing back and saying, look, isn't that funny, instead of making the humour come from the situation itself. You feel he's making the comment on it. And that is sort of not in fashion at the moment, rather like the pun. Everybody groans if you make a pun.
One of England's most admired artists in this style was George Cruikshank. He had great success with his caricatures and used the style to illustrate the Fairy Library and Grimm's fairy tales.
He spans almost the whole of the 19th century, and the extraordinary thing is that his style doesn't change very much. It's much the same in the 1870s as it was when he was illustrating the first English translation of Grimm's fairy tales in the 1820s. So his significance was that he treated the stories he was illustrating for children on the same level that he would treat his adult illustrations. And this was significant too. And he was unusual in children's book illustration in that he used a form etching. The book is a very fine and quite romantic line in his pictures. It's the very elaborate filling in of your picture. In his Cinderella, if you look at the kitchen in which she's found, for example, you see all the background details and everything is filled in a very elaborate way. And this is why you don't find Cruikshank in colour. He himself did do some washes on his illustrations, but I'm not at all sure that they were usually printed in that form because he didn't need colour to make his point.
My favorite Cruikshanks are early Cruikshanks. And I think the Grimm fairy tales, it's the first Edgar Taylor translation ever, is the best Cruikshank there is. They're fantastic. And the fact that the Grimm brothers loved those pictures, and they were right, too. So much life they can't be contained on the page. They just burst out of their seams. There's kicking and yelling and scrapping, and it's what the story, you can hear the din.
Cruikshank was also the first illustrator of Dickens, which made him a prominent artist in Victorian society. He would probably have been surprised by the lasting success of his work for children.
We know not if Mr. Cruikshank will be very pleased at finding his name in such company as that of clown and harlequin, but he, like them, is certainly the children's friend.
An affectionate tribute to his friend George Cruikshank from William Makepeace Thackeray. Thackeray was himself an artist, and for one of his own children's books, The Rose and the Ring, published in 1855, he drew these fanciful illustrations. Thackeray and Cruikshank influenced a group of illustrators working for the publications that had grown out of the new fashion for popular journalism. One of these magazines, Punch, as well as poking fun at Victorian society, was creating a much stabler and healthier environment for artists throughout the 19th century.
Punch and things like the Illustrated London News, which arose in about the 1840s, for the first time offered the illustrator, since they were weekly items, a permanent source of income. So this meant that instead of most illustrators being either hack illustrators or sort of people who wished they were going to be painters or meant to be painters, they now could see themselves as illustrators because all this popular journalism in the middle of the 19th century was offering employment to them. And so a whole school of English illustrators was able to look with confidence to the future and to perfect its art. This washes over into illustrated books, including children's books.
There was another important outlet for illustrators' work in the late 19th century. Painters such as Edmund Dulac, Kay Nielsen, and Arthur Rackham were asked to provide pictures for fairy tales in a new, thriving market for children, the so-called gift book.
Well, a gift book is a contradiction in terms because it's not really meant to be read as most books are. It's much more like modern coffee table book. It's a thing for display that you leave lying around for people to pick up in odd moments and admire, and it forms part of the decoration of your room. They were usually attractively bound and lavishly illustrated and full of rather unlinked items, a miscellany really, but they were well illustrated, and it was a good way for people to earn money, both producing the text and the pictures. And in the end of the century, you get perhaps rather more arty books in which the artist is producing beautiful pictures which could be taken out of the book and put on a wall to be admired, because the art is almost more important than the text which it accompanies.
Gift book was something produced for a very specific market, usually fancy bindings in vellum, lots of gilt. The illustrations would be in full colour, usually mounted separately onto either card or a stronger, heavier paper, and would probably be kept somewhere away from the children, would not really be looked at too much, would be brought out and admired rather than used in sort of any regular sense. They would also be produced in trade bindings. There was particularly somebody like Rackham, who was very popular with the adult market. His books were produced in quite large quantities in trade bindings. And also the publisher would sell editions to people like Boots. Very often you see books with Boots the chemist on them, and they specialised in a great number of the sort of books that had the pretty pictures mounted, tipped into the book.
The painter Arthur Rackham was one of the most celebrated illustrators who contributed pictures to a very large number of gift books. He was the first choice in 1909 to illustrate Kenneth Grahame's Wind in the Willows. Too busy with other projects, it wasn't until the end of his life 30 years later that he produced these rich illustrations for a gift book edition of the story.
I think that possibly Rackham would think of himself as an artist who probably worked through the medium of books. Rackham not only earned his money through his books, but he sold the pictures. He produced the pictures, I think, something like twice. They were double the size that they appeared in the finished book, and they were framed and they went in galleries and they were sold, and he made quite a good living out of it.
In 1907, Rackham drew new designs for Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Over 100 artists like Rackham have tackled this subject before and since. Rackham tended to re-illustrate the established classics. But in 1906, he produced the definitive pictures for J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. But did Rackham's highly ornate style really appeal to children?
Rackham had an impact on children. That's very obvious. Lord Clark said that you had to go to a Rackham illustration prepared because it could frighten you, and he was frightened by them. And if he knew it was a Rackham picture in the book, then he was sort of mentally prepared for it, which I think is indicative of sort of what he's like, rather. you hear tales of people who came across Rackham as children and didn't like him. And he illustrated a great number of children's books. So I think that there will have been children who came across him and liked him and carried that fondness for him over into their adult life, which is why I suspect he is collected as much as he is.
Rackham loved the many fairy tales he illustrated and had his own personal view of their power.
Fairy tales are general truths, rather than particular truths, true to human nature and human ways of considering human experience, sifted and transmuted until they become truer than truth, essence.
But the gift book presents a problem in illustrating for children. Many artists provided pictures for them that appeal more to the adult than the child. Edmund Dulac, like Rackham, tackled many of the classic fairy tales. This is his version of Hans Andersen's story, The Snow Queen. The Danish painter K. Nielsen was another much admired gift book artist. During the 1920s, he painted these ornate illustrations for a book of fantasy, East of the Sun, West of the Moon. The gift book produced beautiful pictures of many differing styles for the traditional children's stories, but was ultimately a dead end in illustrating for children. Adults certainly liked them, and first editions have become desirable and expensive collector's items.
They're coffee table books. Nielsen's a lovely artist. Dulac, lovely artist. But they're not really interesting illustrators. Maybe it's blindness on my part not to allow that they can exist and be something else, but I don't see the purpose for them. They're pretty pictures inserted into a book.
But the gift book artist William Nicholson did have an impact on the development of illustration for children. At the turn of the century, he put new invention into the traditional technique of the woodblock with books such as Alphabet and Square Book of Animals.
William Nicholson, I admire him enormously because after all the sort of terrible elaboration and fussiness of the gift book period, he went back to the old crude outlines of the chapbook and he produced this marvellous, bold outlines, wonderful use of space. Very little colour is usually done on sort of tinted paper with just one or two colours. Again, I'm not sure whether the children would have liked them. Maybe the adult eye just found them enormously restful and dramatic after, which seems contradictory, but they were restful for the eye while having drama in the sort of boldness of their shapes. John Hassell followed in his tradition. I mean, obviously once Nicholson had done it, it just seemed so easy and so obvious to do it like that. And so there were people who followed him like Hassell, who has the same sort of rather poster-like look.
John Hassell had made his name as a poster designer, but only later turned his hand to illustrating for children. His pictures often appeared in books published by Blackie. They have great energy, bright colours, and a strong use of line. His and Nicholson's work strongly influenced the style of the 20th century picture book. Peter and Iona Opie began collecting in the 1940s, and their collection is rich in books from the 18th and 19th centuries. During this century, the world wars hindered the development of children's books. They were low in the order of priorities, and publishers re-released the established classics of children's illustration. In consequence, the Opies bought few books published after 1950. But there is another notable 20th century illustrator that the Opies collected. They bought many books by a great artist whose illustrations have a style and beauty all their own. Edward Arditsoni.
He's got this mastery of line, of being able to say a great deal using very little. He's able to capture movement, I think, in a way that many other artists are not able to. It's motion very often in that state just before motion takes over. So the child is poised for movement, or you can see that the boat is about to rock in a certain direction and that the tea will fall out of the mug.
There is the full blossoming of the picture book in our time. Everything that was Caldecott, everything that was Potter, everything that was Nicholson, and everything that is the best of what is English. Arditsoni's natural-born craftsman. He's done so many things. Let's just talk about the Little Tim series, which are my favorite. It just looks too easy, and they are the best picture books of our times, I think. And what's wonderful is how they garner everything from these people we've been talking about and then turn them into Ted Arditsoni. Totally original. People have tried to look like him, and it's hopeless. You know there's Crookshank there, and there's this there, and there's that. You know he saw them all. And he turned them into Edward Arditsoni, and on top of that, managed the most incredible modesty. There isn't a second to him at all. And the Tim books are tops.
A child who's interested in books, who's interested in reading, has a voracious appetite. And I think they need the good, the bad, and the indifferent, because they need to develop some sort of critical faculty to be able to produce their own yardsticks about what is good, what is bad. And if you feed them only the best, I mean, you know, it's the old story of having turkey every day after Christmas, isn't it? You soon get fed up with it, and you do need some dross. But having said that, I think it's essential that parents do actually try and think about what they're putting in front of their children, and to look very carefully and very critically at the illustration, the quality of the book in general, that they are putting in front of their children.
In the 17th century, I always think of the 17th century Puritan child who probably saw no illustrations at all, so that something like the New England primer, or primer as they call it in the States, was unique. They had no pictures in their church, no stained glass windows. So to have your own little book with these illustrated alphabet, even though they're only thumbnail, it was marvellous. They must have spent hours poring over, wondering what these extraordinary crude scratches meant.
I think there's far too much feeling among more serious people, perhaps, as well as those who don't know, that children's books is kiddie-winky stuff. And I think people fail to realise how much we can learn about social conditions and life of people and all sorts of associated aspects of life from a study of children's books, quite apart from the fact that we were all children once.